Hi, this is build number 12 and this is build number 13. These were two experimental builds where I wanted to try out a whole bunch of new techniques and ideas with clear permission to fail, just so that I could learn more. I also used number 13 to update the My Process page on my website, which is now uploaded. I had planned to make a series of themed videos on each of the techniques that I was trying out, but they all turned out too long and tedious and embarrassing. And as the lady said,
ain't nobody got time for that.
So in this video, I'm going to try and summarise all the things I've learnt, and I might pull in a few of the clips that I recorded along the way. The most significant development, I think, was the bolt-on neck. There are a bunch of drivers for this. It gives me a lot more attempts at getting the neck angle right. Once you've glued it in, it's set and there's not much you can do about it. With a bolt-on neck, you have the opportunity of adjusting things if you've not quite got it right the first try. The other thing that really I saw as a benefit was I've always been very nervous hammering frets, particularly over the body where there wasn't very much reinforcement. Now with the bolt-on neck, there is a lot more reinforcement, so even if the neck is attached, one can feel more confident hammering in the frets, and there is also the opportunity of hammering the frets when the neck is detached. Imagine trying to do this with the fretboard on the guitar. The third benefit was when French polishing, it feels a lot different French polishing the neck when it's not attached to the guitar, and the guitar when it doesn't have a neck to kind of stabilise it and keep it sitting steady. On the other hand, not having to do this interior 90-degree angle is a major benefit. It gives a number of finish choices. You could have a poly on the neck and French polishing on the body, though I haven't actually explored that yet. Some people might like matte on the neck and gloss on the body. I haven't actually tried that. And of course, the ability to stain some timbers without staining the others. In build number 12, the first one, I was kind of making things up as I went along. I got a whole bunch of stuff right and a little bit not quite so much. So in build number 13, I refined the process, tweaked the steps, tweaked the design a little bit, and it turned out a lot nicer. I like the idea. I think it's positive overall, but I will keep alive the idea of doing a glued-in neck, and I might try to make a sort of slightly lighter, simplified version of the neck block for gluing in that would allow me all of the extra confidence when hammering frets over the body. This is build number 13, and it's got a feature that the camera probably won't be able to pick up. In previous builds, the neck thickness has been uniform along here, but in build 13, I put a vertical taper. To do that, I made myself a taper jig. There's only about less than a couple of millimeters between here and here, and when I thickness the neck blank, I place it on this jig, run it underneath the drum sander, and that gives us the taper. The benefits are, apart from playing comfort, you get a relief curve that is slightly more here than here, which is desirable. I've already posted a couple of videos on trying out new timbers. There was one specifically for tone woods for the soundboard, and another about timbers used elsewhere in the construction of the guitar. But in build number 13, I finalised myself on King Billy pine for the kerfed linings. You may recall on a previous build I tried macrocarpa for the kerfed linings. It was a little bit too splitty. Normal radiata pine is just fine, but it's a bit low rent and people might turn their noses up at it. King Billy pine seems to be right in the sweet spot. Bindings. On both of these builds, I reduced the depth of the bindings to about 8.5 mils. They were a bit deeper before. The shallower they are, the less likely there are to be gaps as they follow the curves. On build number 12, I reduced slightly, again, the amount of curvature on the back. That was effective, but I still wasn't quite satisfied. So on number 13, I tried a very mathematical experiment where the height of the sides of the guitar followed a linear circular curve. What that means is that it's nice and curved at the edges here, but in the middle it's a little bit... The reason for that is because we've got curve in 2 dimensions, and as the sides move in at the waist, they naturally need to be a little bit higher to maintain a perfect spherical section at the waist. And with a linear circular profile, that doesn't happen. Now, the bindings here turned out very nicely, but this slight flat area I think could be improved just a little bit. And so next build I'm going to try a hybrid between these two profiles. Another cause of problems with bindings is that when I use my Fox style bender to bend the bindings, there's an awful lot of springback when I take them out. So to combat that, I built myself a bending iron, and I now have the step where I re-establish the actual desired curves of the pieces of bindings so that they conform to where they're going to need to be while at rest. That means that when taping them up, the tape has to do a lot less work because they naturally want to sit in the shape that they're going to end up being. That step was very successful and allowed me to experiment with CA glue gluing in the bindings. On number 12, that was kind of successful, except that I used a bit too much CA glue and it seeped down into the sides, making a few marks that you could only see from certain angles. On number 13, I tried a hybrid glue approach where I put a very small bead of glue around the bindings channels to partially glue in the innermost layer. Then I taped it up, and then I used a lesser amount of CA glue to kind of finish the job and also glue the bindings layers together. Where the outer, thickest layer of the bindings has been rebent to conform perfectly to the final shape, that is the most successful way of gluing on bindings that I have currently tried. As part of the curved back profile experiment, and amidst great clouds of dust, I routed myself a series of radiused sanding dishes. Probably can't see the curve on that, even though it's pretty extreme. I only ever got to use one of them, the shallowest, and I only used it in one specific part of the build, namely the very small section of the fretboard support, part of the neck block, that extends into the body. It needs to raise up just a very, very slight amount to accommodate the neck angle. And I found that the shallowest of my radiused sanding dishes allowed me to get that about right. So I've already posted a video about my adjustable neck angle shooting board and the enormous number 8 plane that I used to adjust the face of the heel to get the neck angle just right. Of course, we can only use the plane while the face of the heel is perfectly flat and unencumbered. But with my process, we can't really test the neck angle until the neck tongue or tenon is glued in and we actually attach it to the body and tighten the bolts. But how do we adjust it then? So I created this slotted sanding jig that allows me to put the tenon into the slot and work the heel face up and down. And I can either just lean from one side to the other or forwards or backwards to just slightly adjust the angle. And I can also put a strip of wax paper along one side so we only sand on the other. With bolt-on neck design, that means we get multiple attempts where we can adjust it, attach the neck, tighten it, check the angle, until it's absolutely perfect. I decided I'd have a go at a bound fretboard. And this was my first attempt, and it is absolutely beautiful. Then I realised that these fancy, challenging and ornate bindings around the wave motif end of my fretboard are completely unsupported. The support ends here, and they'd just be hanging and held down against the body by this bolt, and I would be hammering very close to them, and I was just a bit worried about how secure they would be. So I've kind of decided that a really beautiful bound fretboard like this is only suitable for a glued-on neck. So for the bolt-on neck option, my bound fretboard uses the same timber as the fretboard for the bindings. You can't really see it unless you look very, very carefully. So the advantage of the bound fretboard is purely the tidier fret ends. While hammering in the frets on the bound fretboard, I encountered a problem. I had enlarged the slots as I normally do, just using a compass spike, but I had a great deal of difficulty getting the frets to go in. One explanation is that my fretting saw has lost some of its set and has a narrower kerf than it did before. Another explanation is that on a bound fretboard, this slot is completely sealed on all sides, and since I use just a tiny little bit of tight bond as I hammer in the fret, it could have been just that the air had nowhere to go. A related problem: while hammering really hard to get the frets in, I did a very tiny amount of damage to this unsupported section of the fretboard. So to solve that problem, should it persist, I built this little jig so that I can rest fingerboard in there and hammer away at the frets without any risk to this unsupported area. I've already posted an entire video about my experience with stainless steel frets, but on build 13, owing to very poor planning, I ran out of fret wire. So I used stainless steel frets on the first 3 and nickel silver on the rest. Then it occurred to me that that's actually a pretty good idea, because even if you are a very accomplished guitarist, you still do spend a fair bit of time around in the cowboy chords area. And even if you do work up and down the entire fingerboard, you tend to use a little bit less pressure up here than you do down here, and it's spread out over more frets. But let's face it, the real reason is so that we could start a flame war as to whether these notes are lifeless and brittle and harsh, and these notes are warm and full and organic sounding. Build number 13 also took advantage of my newly acquired CNC router. Now I understand that some folk might regard that as cheating, but I kind of justify it because, as I may have mentioned before, I wrote all the software for digitizing and generating the G-code that actually drives the unit. I use it for my bridges. That allows me to control the weight very precisely, the truss rod cover, and most obviously the headstock logo. I'm going to keep on my website descriptions of all of the steps that I used to take without using the CNC router, because I kind of see myself as an anti-gatekeeper, you know, if I can do it, you can too kind of guy. On the other hand, I am pretty proud of how the new headstock logo is looking, though in future builds I will be experimenting with a darker timber to increase the contrast. As you might have spotted already, on build number 13 I also experimented with a split saddle. This was made easier by the virtue of the CNC router, because I used 2 separate passes to make the bridges, one to do the outline and shaping, and then another with a separate bit to cut the saddle slots. On the other hand, it's a bit more complex having to cut the saddle into 2 pieces and shape those 2 pieces separately. I also made life difficult for myself by delaying a bunch of those steps until the bridge had already been glued on to the French polished soundboard. It's going to be a lot easier if I do the initial steps of fitting the saddle while the bridge is detached. I neglected to mention that this is really only appropriate for 6-string normal guitars. It's not required for basses, and it's not suitable for 12 strings where you have the octave string pairs, each of which requires very different intonation adjustments. For those, I use a thicker 3mm saddle blank and file and carve away accordingly. Let's talk a bit about shellac. In previous builds, I've used this waxed or orange shellac. I need to make up a bit more, I'm running out. It gives the guitar a lovely rich colour, and it ties together into a cohesive whole all the different timber species. On the other hand, if you ever need to do any repairs or adjustments or removing dust specks or levelling, you remove a little bit of it and the colour is uneven and there's just no way of getting it back completely even again. So on the last couple of builds, I have been using the waxed shellac and building it up until I'm happy with the colour, and then switching over to this clear or de-waxed shellac, and then finishing the finish with that. The advantage is that since it's almost perfectly clear, if you need to do a little bit of levelling, you've got a little bit of leeway to get down through before it starts affecting the colour. The other advantage is that it goes on a lot cleaner and smoother and nicer. Obviously you need to use a separate rubber, and almost you don't need a spiriting off phase, and almost you don't need a auto cutting compound phase, and I'm assuming for an experienced French polisher you may not need this one at all. So all in all, it kind of, although it has extra steps and extra jars of various different rubbers, it takes away a lot of the grief and worry and apprehension and stress out of French polishing. So I highly recommend using both shellacs because the colour is really nice, but having the ability to fix little screw-ups is well worth the extra complexity of steps.